She called me over like it was nothing, but the moment I tried to leave, her neighbor made sure I couldn't. It was one of those late afternoons when the sun hung low, casting golden streaks across the quiet street. The widow's house stood at the corner, its garden modest but neatly cared for, roses trembling lightly in the warm breeze. From across the street she looked up as he walked by, her eyes catching his in a way that made him pause, almost unaware of how long he had been staring. There was something in her presence, a quiet confidence softened by a trace of vulnerability, that pulled him toward her without a word. She called his name over the small distance, her voice soft but firm, like a melody just out of reach. "Could you help me for a moment?" she asked, holding a small package against her chest. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of the moment, the unspoken invitation to step closer into her life. The air seemed to shift, even the faint scent of roses carried a tension he couldn't name. He walked toward her, every step deliberate, aware of the subtle quiver of her hand as she extended the package. The brush of skin against skin was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it sent a small jolt up his arm, a spark that made the afternoon feel charged with possibility. There was no overt flirtation, no rushed movement, just the quiet intimacy of two people navigating a simple interaction that felt heavier than it should. The neighbor was there too, leaning lightly against the doorway, her arms crossed but not defensively. Her eyes followed him as he handed over the package, sharp and discerning. There was a calm authority in her gaze, tempered by curiosity, and a warmth that suggested she wasn't just a bystander. He realized, almost reluctantly, that the dynamics of this encounter were not as straightforward as they seemed. The neighbor's presence added an invisible layer of tension, as if she silently gauged whether he belonged here, or whether he would leave too soon. The widow smiled at him, a small, hesitant curve of her lips that held more emotion than words could carry. Her eyes lingered on him, tracing the lines of his expression as though trying to understand what passed silently between them. There was a nervous energy in her posture, a subtle tilting of her head, a slight hesitation before she gestured toward a chair. It was an unspoken invitation to step further into her world, a gentle coaxing that made him want to comply, even without knowing why. He noticed details he might normally overlook, the faint warmth radiating from her hands, the soft rustle of her dress as she shifted, the quiet way her fingers hovered near the package before releasing it. Everything about her spoke of care, of deliberate gentleness, and of an openness that felt rare and fragile. He felt both honored and tentative, aware that this small act of walking over had created a connection, however brief, that lingered in the air like the scent of roses after the wind passes. For a moment, time seemed to suspend itself. The sun slanted across the room, casting a golden halo around her hair, and he realized he was no longer thinking about leaving. The invitation had already done more than summon him across the street. It had begun weaving him into a story he didn't yet understand, one filled with warmth, subtle tension, and the promise of something quietly irresistible. He was about to step toward the door, the package safely delivered, when the neighbor's voice stopped him. It was calm, almost casual, yet there was an underlying firmness that made him hesitate. "Why don't you stay a little longer? Tea, perhaps?" she suggested, tilting her head slightly, eyes observing him with a curiosity that was difficult to ignore. The widow glanced at her, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, as if she wasn't sure how far the neighbor would push, or whether she even should. There was nothing aggressive in the invitation, yet it felt like a gentle, unspoken barrier. The neighbor's stance subtly blocked his path, leaning lightly against the doorframe, shoulders relaxed but unyielding. He realized that leaving now might seem abrupt, almost rude, and yet staying meant stepping into a new, unknown dynamic he hadn't anticipated. A quiet tension settled in the room, unspoken but tangible, like the calm before a storm. He nodded, offering a polite smile, and allowed himself to be guided toward the kitchen. The neighbor moved just enough to create space, her presence lingering like a gentle gravity that kept him near. The widow busied herself with setting cups on the table, her hands brushing briefly against his as she placed the teacups down. The touch was light, accidental in appearance, yet it carried a warmth that was impossible to ignore. Every small gesture, the tilt of her head, the flicker of her gaze, the soft sound of her laughter, seemed carefully measured, inviting him deeper into this intimate space. As the neighbor poured the tea, she leaned slightly closer, her movements deliberate but subtle. Her hand rested briefly on his wrist as she passed the teapot, the contact light yet oddly grounding. It wasn't a touch meant to ignite passion, but it carried a quiet assertion, a reminder that he was now part of their shared moment. The widow watched from across the table, eyes softening, her fingers gently tracing the rim of her cup. There was an unspoken understanding in the room, each of them aware of the delicate balance of proximity, trust, and subtle desire. The conversation began to flow, tentative at first, then growing warmer. The neighbor's voice held a melodic curiosity, asking questions that drew him in without pressure. The widow's replies were soft, tinged with laughter that lingered like a quiet echo, and he noticed the little ways she oriented herself toward him, leaning in just enough to close the physical distance. Each word, each movement, created a rhythm that was intimate without crossing boundaries, a dance of gestures, glances, and shared space. The afternoon light slanted through the curtains, brushing the room with gold, highlighting the soft lines of the widow's face and the keen attentiveness of the neighbor's expression. There was an almost magnetic quality to the way their energy intertwined, a pull that made him acutely aware of every shift in posture, every fleeting smile. The act of staying had already begun to blur the boundaries of intention and curiosity, leaving him suspended between politeness, intrigue, and the quiet recognition that something significant was unfolding. By the time the tea was poured and small talk settled into a gentle comfort, he realized he hadn't once looked at the clock. The neighbor's subtle insistence had transformed a simple delivery into a prolonged, emotionally charged encounter. Leaving now would be impossible without breaking the delicate, unspoken connection that had begun to form between all three of them. Once the initial tension settled, the conversation began to flow more naturally. Words came gently at first, like soft ripples across still water, carrying with them subtle warmth and curiosity. The widow shared small fragments of her life, anecdotes of quiet mornings spent in her garden or evenings with a favorite book. Her voice had a melodic ease, tinged with nostalgia, and he found himself drawn to the way her eyes softened whenever she spoke of past joys or whispered regrets. There was an understated vulnerability in her stories, a quiet loneliness she hadn't voiced to anyone in years, and he felt the gravity of it settle in his chest. The neighbor, ever watchful, leaned back slightly, arms resting casually yet with a subtle authority in her posture. Her laughter punctuated the conversation, light but precise, and there was a teasing quality to the way she engaged with him. She asked questions that were gentle probes, designed to understand him without pushing, and he found himself responding more openly than he had anticipated. Something about her presence, a mixture of assertiveness and warmth, made him want to linger, to listen, to stay. Their physical space was charged with understated intimacy. The widow's hands brushed against his when passing a small plate of cookies, the contact fleeting yet lingering in memory. The neighbor's knee lightly touched his as she shifted to reach a teacup, the gesture casual in appearance, but impossible to ignore. Each touch, each glance, created a quiet tension that hummed beneath the surface, unspoken but palpable. The room felt smaller somehow, not claustrophobic but intimate, filled with the subtle gravity of three lives converging in unexpected alignment. The conversation meandered seamlessly between light-hearted banter and moments of reflection. The widow admitted, almost shyly, how she sometimes felt invisible in her quiet life, how the walls of her home echoed with memories she couldn't quite let go. The neighbor offered understanding without intrusion, her tone gentle yet grounded, making him aware of the care each woman had for one another, and, unexpectedly, for him. He realized that this space, these shared moments, was creating an emotional closeness that was both fragile and profound. The sunlight shifted, casting soft shadows across the room, highlighting the subtle movements of the women, the way the widow's fingers lingered over the teacup rim, the way the neighbor's eyes sparkled with amused curiosity. Each detail etched itself into his awareness, the warmth radiating from their proximity, the quiet rhythm of their breathing, the pauses between words that felt loaded with unspoken meaning. It was a dance of gestures and silences, of laughter and careful glances, each one carrying an emotional weight that went unnoticed by anyone outside this little circle. As the conversation deepened, he became acutely aware of the way trust was forming, delicate yet undeniable. The widow's smiles grew more relaxed, her posture less guarded, while the neighbor's teasing softened into genuine warmth. He felt himself caught in the current of their subtle attention, realizing that he was no longer just a visitor, but a participant in a quiet, unfolding intimacy. Every shared story, every lingering glance, and every accidental touch was building a bridge between them, a bridge of trust, warmth, and a quietly kindled curiosity about what lay beyond this afternoon. By the time the sun dipped lower, coloring the room in amber hues, the sense of comfort and connection was undeniable. There was laughter, shared understanding, and a subtle, unspoken acknowledgement of each other's presence that went far beyond the casual acquaintance he had arrived as. In those quiet conversations, a bond was forming, gentle yet insistent, setting the stage for the emotional complexities that were yet to come. The afternoon had shifted into a softer light, the golden hue of the sun filtering through the curtains and painting the room in warmth. The earlier casualness had given way to a more intimate rhythm. He began noticing things he hadn't before, the way the widow's eyes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking, the subtle tilt of her head as if weighing each word he spoke. There was a quiet gravity in her presence now, a vulnerability wrapped in elegance, and it pulled at something deep inside him. The neighbor, ever perceptive, didn't let the moment pass unnoticed. Her glances were quick but deliberate, a silent gauge of his reactions, her posture relaxed yet subtly commanding. She asked questions not out of idle curiosity, but with a purpose that made him feel observed yet strangely safe. He realized that between the two women, a delicate balance of tension and care was forming, one that made his chest tighten and his thoughts tangle with a warmth he couldn't quite name. Small touches became electric. The widow's fingers brushed his hand as she reached for a teacup, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. It was casual in appearance, yet he felt the pulse of connection in that fleeting contact. At the same time, the neighbor rested her hand near his on the table, her palm occasionally grazing his, each touch intentional yet understated. It was a conversation without words, a shared understanding transmitted through skin, proximity, and subtle gestures. The room seemed to shrink around them, not in a suffocating way, but as if the three of them existed in a private orbit, separate from the rest of the world. Laughter came easily now, but there were also pauses, small, almost imperceptible gaps where the weight of unspoken thoughts hung in the air. He noticed how the widow's eyes softened when she listened to him, how the neighbor's smile deepened with amusement when he shared a quiet joke. Each of these moments, brief and understated, carried an emotional weight far greater than the words themselves. He also became aware of his own reactions, the pull toward them, the sudden alertness whenever their hands moved close, the subtle quickening of his breath when a brush of hair or a fleeting touch lingered longer than it should. The tension wasn't uncomfortable. It was magnetic, quietly building a connection that was impossible to ignore. He recognized the careful attention the women paid to him and to each other, their gestures filled with empathy, patience, and a delicate, shared curiosity. There was a silent dialogue in every glance, every brush of a shoulder, every small movement. The widow seemed to test the boundaries of closeness without crossing them, and the neighbor guided the space with gentle authority. Both women were pulling him into a world that felt both tender and charged, where care and desire coexisted quietly, and he was aware of the responsibility of navigating this subtle web of emotion. By the time the sunlight began to wane, coloring the room in soft amber, the air between them had shifted. What had started as a simple visit was now laden with possibility, a mix of trust, tentative longing, and the fragile excitement of connection. In that quiet space, he realized that the relationships forming were more than passing interactions. They were the first threads of something deeply resonant, a slow-building intimacy that promised to shape the days ahead in ways he was only beginning to understand. The conversation had reached a comfortable rhythm, soft laughter filling the room, when a small mishap changed everything. The widow, reaching for a teacup that had been placed just a bit too close to the edge of the table, accidentally tipped it. Tea spilled, warm and fragrant, across the surface, sending the cup teetering dangerously before he instinctively reached to catch it. Their hands met as they both tried to steady the cup, fingers brushing in a spark of warmth that lingered longer than either expected. The neighbor reacted immediately, stepping closer, her voice calm yet threaded with concern. "Here, let me help," she said, her hand lightly guiding his to ensure no further spillage. The contact was casual, almost ordinary, yet it carried a magnetic intimacy, a reminder of the physical closeness they had been skirting around all afternoon. He felt a quiet rush of awareness, the brush of her fingers, the proximity of her body, and the subtle warmth that radiated from the shared space between them. Once the cup was safely set back down, they all paused for a moment, breathing in the small chaos that had brought them so close together. The widow's cheeks carried a faint blush, her hands lingering on the table as if reluctant to retreat from the shared contact. Her gaze met his briefly, soft and unguarded, as though acknowledging the unspoken electricity that had just passed between them. He realized that the incident, small as it seemed, had allowed a vulnerability to surface, a moment where the barriers between them were gently, irreversibly lowered. The neighbor leaned slightly closer as she handed a napkin to the widow, her shoulder brushing lightly against his. The gesture was deliberate enough to be noticed but casual enough to feel natural. Each movement, each accidental touch, seemed charged with a quiet, compelling tension. It was not romantic in the conventional sense, not overt, but each small contact carried a weight he could feel in his chest, a warmth, an alertness, an awareness of presence that had nothing to do with words. They laughed softly about the mishap, the sound warm and easy, yet under the laughter there was a shared understanding, a recognition that something subtle and meaningful had shifted. The widow's smile was slower, more thoughtful now, lingering in a way that spoke of trust forming, while the neighbor's teasing remarks carried a hint of intimacy, of playful familiarity that drew him in even more. He noticed how the two women interacted with each other as well, quiet glances, shared smiles, a mutual understanding that included him, weaving him into their little world. He became acutely aware of the rhythm of the room, the widow's soft movements, the neighbor's measured gestures, and his own responses to each. Every brush of a hand, every accidental touch, every slight shift in posture seemed to carry more meaning than mere coincidence. The room felt smaller, warmer, charged with the quiet electricity of human connection, and he realized that what had started as a simple visit had become something intimate, meaningful, and quietly transformative. By the time the laughter subsided and they settled back into their chairs, the three of them were connected in ways they hadn't been before. The small accident had created an intimacy that was gentle, unexpected, and safe, yet impossible to ignore. In that moment, he understood that their bond was deepening, formed through shared gestures, subtle touches, and the unspoken acknowledgement of trust and closeness. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding, a quiet intimacy that promised even richer emotional terrain in the days ahead. The afternoon sun had dipped lower, casting long, warm streaks of light across the room, and a quieter rhythm settled over their conversation. The laughter from earlier had faded into soft murmurs, a space where words carried more weight and silences were just as meaningful. It was in this calm that the widow's voice softened, tentative, almost fragile. "Sometimes I feel invisible," she admitted, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. There was no bitterness in her tone, just a quiet honesty that made him pause. He looked at her, noticing the subtle tremor in her hands and the vulnerability in her eyes, a vulnerability she rarely showed anyone. The neighbor's attention sharpened, yet her approach remained gentle. "You've been through a lot," she said, leaning slightly forward, her hand brushing against the table near his. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it carried a quiet reassurance. He felt the warmth radiating from her hand, a steady presence that grounded him in the moment. There was a silent understanding between the two women, a shared recognition of his role in this delicate space. He shifted slightly, aware of the tension between honesty and hesitation, curiosity and restraint. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but was mindful of the balance he needed to maintain. His fingers brushed briefly against the widow's as he passed her a napkin, the touch lingering longer than necessary. The warmth of her skin, combined with the quiet steadiness of her gaze, made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar intensity. He realized that the intimacy between them had grown beyond gestures. It was now about trust, vulnerability, and unspoken emotions. The neighbor, sensing the shift, smiled softly, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that was both playful and serious. "It's rare to meet someone who listens the way you do," she murmured, and though the words were simple, they carried weight. Her hand grazed his wrist lightly as she reached for her own teacup, a subtle signal of closeness, of connection. He felt the electric pull of proximity, the quiet desire to remain present, and the internal struggle of navigating emotions he hadn't anticipated. The widow, noticing the ease with which the neighbor interacted with him, offered a small, tentative smile. I'm glad you stayed," she admitted, voice soft but steady. Her words were gentle, yet they carried a depth of feeling that resonated in the room. He realized that the connection wasn't just with her, it was with both women, in the delicate balance of attention, care, and subtle attraction that had formed over the afternoon. In that shared space, confessions mingled with hesitations. The widow revealed a quiet longing for companionship, while the neighbor hinted at admiration for his sincerity, each statement carefully balanced, revealing without overwhelming. He felt the weight of their trust, the fragility of the moment, and the warmth that came from being seen, truly seen, by both of them. Every glance, every lingering touch, every pause carried the possibility of deeper connection. By the time the sunlight softened into amber, the room held an unspoken agreement. A delicate intimacy had formed, built on honesty, gentle desire, and mutual respect. He knew that this was more than fleeting. It was the beginning of something quietly transformative, a slow-burn connection that would continue to grow as they navigated the emotions and hesitations of hearts intertwined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the room was bathed in a gentle, amber glow, softening edges and filling the space with warmth. The teacups had long since been emptied, yet none of them made a move to leave. The widow leaned back slightly in her chair, a serene calm settling over her features. The neighbor sat close enough that their shoulders almost touched, yet far enough to respect the subtle boundaries that had grown organically over the afternoon. The male narrator found himself caught in the quiet gravity of the moment, feeling included, acknowledged, and profoundly connected. They spoke little, but the silence wasn't empty. It was rich with understanding, a shared rhythm of breathing and subtle movements. The widow's fingers brushed the edge of his hand as she reached for a small plate of cookies, a fleeting touch that spoke volumes of trust and tentative affection. The neighbor's elbow rested gently against his, the contact light but grounding, a reminder of the closeness that had built between them without words. In these small, careful gestures, the three of them communicated a depth of feeling that transcended conversation. The widow smiled softly, her gaze lifting to meet his with an ease that had been absent at the start of the day. I'm glad you stayed," she said, the words simple yet loaded with unspoken emotion. The neighbor's eyes flickered with warmth and amusement, a playful glint tempered by sincerity. "It seems we all needed this," she added, her voice low and steady, her hand brushing briefly against his wrist in a gesture that was both intimate and protective. The narrator felt the weight of their presence, the subtle gravity of their combined attention, and a quiet ache of contentment settled in his chest. They began talking again, but the tone had shifted. The conversation was no longer tentative or exploratory, it was familiar, comfortable, intimate. They shared small stories, memories, and quiet reflections, each one deepening the emotional bond that had been growing all afternoon. The widow's laughter was lighter now, more genuine, carrying a warmth that seemed to fill the room. The neighbor's gentle teasing had softened into thoughtful commentary, her eyes continually returning to him with a mixture of curiosity, trust, and subtle affection. Physical closeness remained understated but meaningful. Shoulders brushed, hands grazed the edge of a table, fingers occasionally touching as if drawn together by some silent force. There were no overt declarations, no dramatic gestures, only the quiet, steady intimacy of shared space, mutual understanding, and emotional resonance. The narrator felt the profound pull of connection, not just toward one of them, but toward both, as their energies intertwined in a harmonious balance that felt natural and inevitable. As the evening settled, the three of them sat in companionable silence, leaning slightly toward one another, sharing the warmth of proximity. He noticed the subtle shifts in posture, the soft smiles exchanged between the women, and the quiet contentment in their eyes. The day's slow burn had reached a gentle, fulfilling peak, a connection built on trust, shared vulnerability, and understated romantic tension that had resolved into warmth rather than urgency. In that golden light, the narrator realized that this afternoon had become more than a simple visit. It was the beginning of a rare, delicate intimacy, one that honored each of their vulnerabilities while fostering trust, affection, and quiet desire. The bonds formed were gentle but enduring, and as they sat together, he knew that the story of their connection had reached a harmonious, emotionally satisfying resolution, a slow-burn romance fulfilled in subtle, beautiful ways.